The letter was the last thing she expected to find inside her dead mother's jewelry box. It wasn't the faded photograph that stopped Grace Holloway's heart, though that did its damage soon enough. It was the handwriting on the envelope. It was neat, elegant, and unmistakably Miriam's, as though her mother had reached through the earth and placed a cold hand on her shoulder. Grace, open this when I am gone. After a small moment of contemplation, Grace opened it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the letter, there was Luca. And before Luca, there was a little girl on a rainy Tuesday, and a man sitting alone in a diner who had already decided he was done. The diner was called Sal's. It smelled the way all diners should: fried butter, burnt coffee, and something sweet underneath that you could never quite identify. Rain hammered the windows and sheets. The booths were red vinyl, cracked at the seams, and the overhead lights hummed faintly. The man at the far end of the diner had not touched his food. Broad across the shoulders, dark hair, slightly damp from the rain, hands flat on the table. He stared at the space between his coffee cup and the wall, and the stare had no destination. It was the stare of someone who had already arrived somewhere terrible and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. His name was Emilio Caruso, and though the diner didn't know that, the city did. Half of it feared him, and the other half owed him something. Tonight, none of that mattered to him. Tonight, he had made a decision. At a booth near the window, a woman sat across from her 9-year-old daughter. French by birth and Italian by blood, she carried herself with the elegance of someone who had moved through dangerous rooms and learned to look effortless doing it. Dark hair pinned at the nape of her neck. A silk blouse on a Tuesday evening, because she believed dressing well was a form of self-respect. Her name was Miriam, and she was watching the man at the far end of the diner with an expression her daughter couldn't read. The little girl had ginger hair and blue eyes and had been swinging her legs under the booth for 10 minutes. "Mama," Grace said, tugging the sleeve of Miriam's blouse. "That man hasn't eaten anything." Miriam didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the man, something moving behind her gaze, some old recognition, and a private grief she kept filed neatly away where her daughter couldn't see it. "He looks like he forgot how to be happy," Grace added, with the devastating accuracy that only children possess. Miriam turned to look at her daughter then. Those wide, earnest blue eyes. That absolute certainty that sadness in a stranger was simply a problem to be solved. "Then let's remind him," Miriam said quietly. She called the waitress over and ordered a hot meal sent to the man's table. Grace tore a piece of paper from her school notebook and uncapped a red crayon with serious concentration. She pressed her tongue between her teeth as she wrote, the way she always did when something mattered. When the plate arrived at his table, the note was tucked beneath it, folded once. The man looked up for the first time in an hour. He unfolded the note slowly and read it. "Someone sees you. Eat." Slightly smiling face. Then he looked across the diner until his eyes found the little girl, ginger-haired, watching him with open expectation, already smiling before he'd done anything to earn it. Emilio Caruso looked down at the note again. Then he picked up his fork. He didn't know, sitting in that diner with a child's crayon drawing in his hand, that he had just been given back his life. He didn't know that 15 years later, he would keep that note framed on his study wall, moved to every home he'd lived in since. He didn't know the little girl would grow up and walk into a building he quietly funded, or that his son would look at her across a doorway and feel something shift that no amount of training had prepared him for. He only knew that someone had seen him, and that it was enough to make him stay.
If you are new here, welcome. I'm about to tell you a story that will reach into your chest and rearrange things. Before we go any further, if this is already gripping you, smash that like button right now and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, let's go back.
15 years later, Grace Holloway was 24 and running 12 minutes late on her first day at Casa Luz. She jaywalked across Meridian Street with a canvas tote on one shoulder, a thermos of tea in her left hand, and her ginger hair loose around her shoulders because she'd been halfway through pinning it up when she lost 4 minutes searching for the address on her phone. Cream linen blouse, wide-legged trousers the color of oatmeal, flat sandals that were already regretting the cobblestones. She pushed through the front door at 9:12 a.m. and was immediately hit by fresh paint and something herby from the kitchen at the back. Casa Luz occupied a converted townhouse on the quieter edge of the financial district. 3 floors, pale walls, mismatched chairs in the common room, a corkboard near the entrance layered in schedules, and a child's drawing of a sun that someone had pinned up and never taken down. Functional. Stripped of anything that felt like comfort, as though warmth was an indulgence they hadn't budgeted for. Grace clocked all of this in 8 seconds and was already mentally rearranging the furniture. "Miss Holloway?" Her supervisor Sandra appeared from a side office with a clipboard and glasses pushed up onto her forehead. "You're late." "I know, I'm sorry," she apologized. "Come on," Sandra said, already walking. "Operations director is already in. Don't rearrange anything without running it by him first." "Of course," Grace said. She had already clocked the fairy lights she was going to put up in the common room. The operations office was at the end of the first-floor hallway, door half open. Sandra knocked twice and pushed it wider. "Luca, our new social worker." Grace stepped in. The man had his back to her. Standing at the window with one hand braced against the frame, and the other holding a phone to his ear, speaking in low-clipped Italian, he cut off the moment Sandra knocked. Broad through the shoulders in a way the fitted black shirt made no attempt to conceal. Sleeves rolled to the elbow. Dark ink climbing his left forearm. Black hair tied loosely at the nape of his neck. He turned, and Grace noticed his striking green eyes, with gold flecks scattered across. The kind of eyes that registered everything in a room before settling on you. A jaw darkened with stubble. Not the face of a man who smiled easily. Those eyes moved over Grace in one quiet sweep, not rude or lingering. Just thorough. The way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to trust. Luca Caruso. He extended a hand. Grace Holloway. She shook it. Firm and brief. He held her gaze one beat past comfortable, then looked back at Sandra. Briefing in 10. In the hallway, Grace glanced back once. He had already turned to the window, voice dropped to nothing. She told herself the feeling in her chest was just nerves about the new job. She was a social worker. She knew how to identify a lie. The first 2 weeks at Casa Luz were ordinary in the way that things are ordinary just before they stop being ordinary. Grace learned the residents quickly. Adiz, who always sat facing the door. Priya, a teenager who ate her meals standing up, as though sitting down meant she'd decided to stay, and she hadn't made that call yet. And Felix, a 4-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a word since he arrived and carried a blue toy rabbit everywhere with the focus of someone transporting something irreplaceable. Grace rearranged the common room on her 3rd day. Warmer chair configuration. Cushions from the storeroom. A kettle from a back cupboard. Fairy lights along the window shelf. Sandra saw it and said nothing, which Grace took as approval. But when Luca saw it and said nothing, Grace took it as something else entirely. He was not an unkind man. She worked that out quickly. He was precise and controlled, and consistently present. The residents responded to him with an ease that surprised her. He didn't perform warmth. He simply gave people his full attention when they spoke, and somehow, that was enough. She caught herself watching him more than she should. He caught her catching herself twice, and said nothing about that either. What they did instead was argue, professionally, about intake procedures. The current form asks residents to list previous addresses going back 5 years, Grace said, standing in his doorway on a Friday afternoon. "Do you understand what you're asking a woman who has spent 3 of those years hiding to do?" Luca looked up from his desk. "It's standard," he said for the 3rd time. "No, it's re-traumatizing," she retorted and held up the form. 3 pages. On their first day. Before they've even seen their room. Something moved in his expression. "What would you change?" 1 page. Name. Emergency contact. Medical needs. That's it for day 1. Everything else waits until they feel safe enough to give it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Write up the revision. And maybe I'll review it." She had expected more resistance. The lack of it was somehow more unsettling. "Thank you," she said. "Close the door on your way out." She did, and stood in the hallway for a second with her back against the wall, not entirely sure what had just happened. The night of the storm, Grace was the last staff member in the building. It had started as a gray afternoon and accelerated into something the weather app described as a severe weather event affecting the entire region. Roads flooded by 6. Sandra sent a group message. "Stay put if you're still there. Transport suspended. Sorry. There are blankets in the supply closet." 6 residents remained, including Felix and his rabbit. Grace was in the kitchen at 7, staring at the open pantry, when she heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to find Luca in the doorway. He'd shed his jacket and was wearing just a black shirt, sleeves already rolled. He looked at the pantry, then at the 6 residents through the kitchen hatch, and then finally at Grace. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Can you?" "Well enough." He shrugged and moved to the pantry, assessing it with brisk efficiency. "We can make pasta. There's enough for everyone." They cooked side by side in a kitchen too small for 2 people who had not yet decided what they were to each other. He chopped and she stirred. He passed things without being asked, which she noticed without commenting on. The rain threw itself against the window in waves, and the light was warm and too yellow, and at some point the silence between them stopped being the careful silence of co-workers and became something else, a silence with texture to it, that both of them were aware of and neither addressed. It was Felix who broke it. The little boy appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks, blue rabbit under one arm, lower lip doing something precarious. He looked at Grace, then at Luca, then back at Grace. Luca crouched down without hesitation, dropping to Felix's eye level in one fluid movement that made a large man in a kitchen become the least threatening thing in the room. "Hey," Luca said quietly. "You hungry?" Felix looked at him for a long time. Then he took 3 careful steps forward and held the blue rabbit out to Luca, which was, Grace would later learn, the greatest act of trust Felix had shown since he arrived. Luca took the rabbit with both hands as though it were precious, examined it with complete seriousness. "Cute rabbit," he said gravely. "Very cute rabbit." Felix almost smiled. Luca stood, handed the rabbit back, and ruffled the boy's hair. "Go sit down. Food will be ready in 5 minutes." Felix went. Grace turned back to the pasta and stirred it with slightly more focus than it required. "You're good with him," she said to the pot. "He just needs to know there's no threat." Luca came to stand beside her. "Children are honest about fear. They don't pretend." Grace agreed wholeheartedly. Most adults could learn from that. Luca nodded in agreement. Indeed, but most adults are too afraid of what they'd have to admit. She looked at him, only to see that he was looking at the pot. The kitchen was warm, and the storm was loud, and she was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "I'll call them in," she said, and stepped back. They ate at the big common room table. All 8 of them, mismatched chairs and too few forks, and a candle someone found in the supply closet that Sandra would never know about. Adiz told a story about her grandmother's goat that made Priya actually laugh, bright and unexpected in the room. Felix ate an entire bowl of pasta and fell asleep on the sofa with his rabbit before anyone noticed. Later, when the residents had gone to bed, Grace found herself on the back step with a glass of wine from a bottle left in the pantry, splitting it with Luca because it would have been strange not to. He sat beside her, forearms on his knees, and they looked out at the garden in the rain. "Why do you do this?" Grace asked. She had not planned to ask it. "Are you really asking me why I run the shelter?" Luca raised a brow. Grace was direct with her words. "You both fund and manage it when you clearly don't need the work." She looked at him sideways, and his jaw tightened fractionally. "You don't seem like someone who does such things accidentally." He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd chosen not to answer. "Someone showed me once," he said finally, "that feeding a person is the most radical thing you can do for them. It says, you matter enough to be kept alive." Grace felt something move in her chest. Old and inexplicable, like déjà vu before you understand it. "Someone important?" she asked. He looked at her. "Just for a moment. Someone I never met." He said it like a complete answer. She didn't push. They sat in the rain sound and the dark, and the wine was almost gone, and when his arm brushed hers on the narrow step, he didn't move away, and neither did she. Luca stood first. He held his hand down to pull her up, and she took it, and he held it 1 second longer than necessary before letting go. "You should get some sleep," he said. "Yeah, and so should you." He almost smiled. She caught the very edge of it before it disappeared. She told herself, climbing the stairs with a blanket from the supply closet, that she was not in any danger whatsoever. 24 years of watching her mother be the smartest woman in every room, and Grace Holloway still hadn't learned to recognize the exact moment a lie becomes the most dangerous kind, the kind you tell yourself. Outside, the rain didn't let up till morning, and somewhere across the city, in a private office on the 14th floor, a phone rang on Emilio Caruso's desk. He answered on the second ring. "She's there," said the voice. "She started this week." Emilio was quiet. He looked at the wall across from his desk, at the small framed piece of paper with crayon letters, faded now with 15 years of being moved and rehung, and looked at the way a person looks at the thing that saved them. "I know," he said. Does Luca know who she is? A longer pause. Not yet, said the voice on the other line. Emilio ended the call and sat in the silence of his office for a very long time. Outside his window, the same rain that was soaking the shelter garden drummed against the glass. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey he did not drink. He looked at the note on the wall. Someone sees you. Eat. He hoped, with the helplessness of a man who had spent a lifetime being afraid of nothing, that his son was being careful. And he suspected, with the certainty of a man who knew his son, that he was already too late to hope for that. 3 weeks after the storm, Luca kissed her in the shelter garden. It was not romantic in the way films make things romantic. No golden light, no swelling music. It was a Tuesday evening. The garden smelled of wet soil and the basil someone had planted in a window box that was barely surviving. Grace had her back to him, deadheading the one flower that had somehow taken root in the far corner, and he had come outside to tell her a delivery had arrived. He said her name once. She turned, and he was closer than she expected, and then his hands were on either side of her jaw and his mouth was on hers, certain and unhesitating, the way he did everything, and for 4 seconds the world reduced itself to that. Then he pulled back. His hands stayed at her jaw. His eyes were open, and they were doing that thing she had noticed in his office doorways and across dinner tables, registering everything before deciding. I shouldn't, he said. Why? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He lowered his hands slowly. The absence of them was immediate and cold. Because I'm not a safe person to love, Grace. She searched his face for the performance of it, for the rehearsed line, the strategic vulnerability. She had worked with enough damaged people to know the difference between someone who said, I'm not safe as a warning, and someone who said it as seduction. What she found instead was something quieter and worse, a man who meant it absolutely, and was telling her anyway. That's not a reason, she said. It's the only one I have. He went back inside. She stood in the garden alone for a long time, the basil box dripping quietly beside her, and pressed her fingers briefly to her lips. Dangerous, she thought. She went back inside too. She filed these away, waiting for the picture to complete itself. And it completed itself on a Friday night, 3 weeks after the garden. She had stayed late to finish a case report. The building was quiet. Luca's office light was still on, which was not unusual. He kept hours that suggested either dedication or insomnia or both. She was passing his door on her way out when she heard the second voice. Low. Male. Italian. Not Luca. She should have kept walking, but instead she stopped. The Ferrano family is getting impatient, the voice said. Your father has delayed the meeting twice. They're starting to interpret it as disrespect. A pause. Then Luca spoke, in a cold tone that she had not heard from him before. My father will meet with them when he decides to meet with them. Tell Ferrano that if he wants to interpret anything, he can start by interpreting what happened to the last man who pushed this family on a timeline. Silence. Now get out of my building. Luca growled to the strange man. Grace pressed herself flat against the wall beside the door and did not breathe. Footsteps. The office door opened fully. A man she had never seen before walked past her into the hallway. Dark suit, the particular stillness of someone professionally trained to notice things, and he looked directly at her as he passed. He said nothing and kept walking. She stood in the hallway with her case notes pressed to her chest and her heart slamming loud enough that she was certain Luca could hear it through the open door. He appeared in the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable in the way a locked room is inaccessible. How much did you hear? He asked. Enough, she said. He stepped back from the door. Come in. I don't think I should. Grace. Not a command. Something closer to a concession. Come in. She went in. He didn't sit down, and neither did she. He stood at the window with his arms crossed, and she stood near the door, and the desk between them felt like it had been placed there on purpose. I know you have questions, go ahead and ask, he said. Who was that man? Grace said finally. Someone who works directly for my family. What kind of family? Grace continued with her questions, her eyebrow raising slightly. He held her gaze steadily. The kind you've read about, he answered, looking her dead in the eyes. 3 days ago, alone on her sofa at midnight with her laptop screen the only light in the room, Grace had typed Caruso family into a search engine and sat with the results for a very long time. Old articles, court cases that went nowhere, names mentioned in the same breath as politicians and shipping routes, and a string of legitimate businesses, so broad they read like camouflage. The Caruso family, she said. Yes. Organized crime. My family has operated in ways that the law has found difficult to categorize, he said, and then something moved across his face. Contempt, she realized, directed inward. Which is a coward's way of saying yes. Grace set her case notes down on his desk. She did it slowly, buying herself a second to decide what she actually wanted to know. And this, she gestured at the room, at the building around them. What is this? This is real. He said it without hesitation, which was the only reason she kept listening. Casa Luz is real. Every shelter, every fund, it's all real. It's not laundering. It's not optics. He paused. It's what I chose to do with money that came from things I didn't choose. Did you ever? She stopped. Did I ever what? He asked. Did you ever do anything you can't come back from? The silence lasted exactly long enough to tell her the answer was complicated. I have been part of a world where terrible things were done, he said carefully. There are decisions I made to protect my family that I would make differently now. There are things I looked away from that I should have faced. He held her gaze. But I have never put my hands on anyone who didn't come at me first. That's the truth. I can't prove it to you. I can only tell you. Grace looked at him for a long time. The man across from her, tattooed forearms, dark eyes careful and exhausted, standing in the building he ran as his private act of penance, was telling her the truth. She was sure of it in the way she was sure of things about people, the low, quiet certainty that came from years of learning to read what someone's body did when their mouth was performing. It was clear to her that he wasn't performing, which almost made it worse. I need to think, she said. I know. She picked up her case notes. At the door she stopped. Luca. He looked at her. The intake revision. The residence. Felix. She paused. Was real too? Yes, he said quietly. Of course it was. She left. He stood at the window of his office for a long time after the front door closed, watching the black car on the street below. After a moment, he pulled out his phone. His father answered before the second ring. She knows, Luca said. A long pause. Then Emilio said simply, What are you going to do? Luca looked down at the street. I don't know yet. She's Miriam's daughter, his father said. Not new information. A reminder. I know who she is. Luca sighed. Then you know this is not simple. It never really is. He ended the call. Below, the black car finally pulled away. Grace did not sleep. She lay in her flat with the ceiling above her and Miriam's face in her mind. Her mother at the diner booth, silk blouse, watching that man with the expression Grace had never been able to read. The expression she understood now, in the way you understand things too late. Recognition. At 2 a.m. she got up, made tea she didn't drink, and sat at her kitchen table. She turned her phone over in her hands. Put it down. Picked it up again. The thought of calling him crossed her mind more times than she could count, but she persevered and finally fell asleep again. She went to work on Monday. He was in his office when she arrived. He didn't come out to greet her as usual, and she didn't bother to knock. They existed in the building like two people navigating around something breakable on the floor between them, both careful, neither acknowledging what they were being careful about. By Wednesday, it was Adiz who noticed. You're quieter, Adiz said, finding Grace in the kitchen after lunch, both of them washing up side by side. Tired, Grace corrected. Adiz handed her a mug to dry. The physical tiredness, or the kind of tired when something is sitting heavy on you? Grace dried the mug. The second one, she admitted. Adiz nodded and handed her another. In my experience, she said, the things that sit heaviest are the ones we already know the answer to. We just don't like what the answer costs. Grace looked at her. I'm not asking what it is, Adiz added. I'm just saying. She handed Grace the last mug and walked out. Grace stood alone in the kitchen, drying a mug that was already dry, and thought about what things cost. It was Felix who broke the standoff. Thursday morning, 10 days after the garden. Grace arrived to find Luca crouched in the common room doorway, speaking quietly to Felix, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his blue rabbit and something new, a piece of paper and a box of crayons that Luca must have brought in, because they hadn't been there yesterday. Felix was drawing something, showing it to Luca, who studied it with the grave seriousness he always applied to whatever Felix offered him. Grace stopped in the hallway. On the paper, in the uneven lines of a child still learning how hands and intentions connected, were two figures. A big one and a small one. The big one had dark scribbles for hair. The small one had orange scribbles for hair. Felix pointed at the orange-haired figure. Then he pointed at Grace, standing in the doorway. He had not spoken a word in 5 weeks. He opened his mouth. "Grace," he said. One word, quiet as breath. But the room heard it. Luca looked up. His eyes found hers over Felix's head, and something in his face came undone. Just for a moment, just a crack in the controlled surface, and in that crack she saw it. Not the Caruso name, not the black car on the street, or the man in the dark suit, or the lowered voice on a phone. Just Luca, who had kept a 4-year-old boy company with a box of crayons on a Thursday morning because a child needed someone to sit with him. Grace crouched down to Felix's eye level. "Is that me?" she asked, pointing at the orange figure. Felix nodded. "Who's that?" She pointed at the dark-haired one. Felix looked at Luca, then back at the drawing. He picked up a black crayon, and with the focus of someone making something permanent, drew a small straight line on the big figure's wrist. A tattoo. Grace's throat did something she wasn't prepared for. "What a beautiful drawing," she said, around whatever was happening in her chest. Felix held the picture out to her. He wanted her to have it. She took it with both hands. Grace knocked on Luca's office door that evening, an hour after Felix's bedtime, when the building had gone quiet and the only sounds were the street outside and the old boiler in the basement. He called for her to come in. Jacket off. Shirt sleeves rolled. The remains of a coffee at his elbow that had gone cold hours ago. He looked like a man who had been sitting with his own thoughts for too long, which she recognized because she had been doing the same thing for 10 days. She put Felix's drawing down on his desk. He looked at it. A long, still look. "I'm not running," she said. He raised his eyes to hers. "I'm not saying it doesn't scare me," she continued, "because it does. I'm also not saying I understand all of it, or that I've decided how I feel about all of it." She held his gaze. "I'm saying I'm not running. Not yet." He was quiet for a moment. "You should probably run," he advised. "You keep saying that," she argued. "And I mean it wholeheartedly," he replied. "I know," she said, not moving. "That's actually why I'm not." He stood up from his desk. Slowly, the way a man moves when he's deciding with every step. He came around to her side and stopped close enough that she could see the gold in his eyes catching the lamp. "You deserve someone without a name like mine," he said quietly. "Maybe," she said, "but we're both already here." He reached up and tucked a strand of ginger hair behind her ear with a gentleness so deliberate it barely felt like something a man like him should be capable of. "We're already here," he repeated. He didn't kiss her again. He didn't need to. He just stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth off him, and looked at her like she was the most bewildering thing that had ever happened to him, which, she would later think, might have been the most honest thing he'd ever said without a word. What she did not know, in that quiet office, was that 2 floors above the city's awareness, a meeting had taken place that afternoon in a private room at the Caruso estate that would make everything harder. Emilio Caruso sat at the head of a long table. Across from him, 2 men from the Ferrano family, a name that moved through certain circles the way storm systems moved through weather maps. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. The younger Ferrano, Marco, mid-30s, the kind of handsome that had curdled slightly from too much being given too easily, leaned forward with his hands flat on the table. "We've been patient, Emilio." "I appreciate that," Emilio said. "We want the northern distribution route. A simple agreement." "Nothing about what you're proposing is simple, Marco." Emilio scoffed. "Then let's make it simple." Marco's eyes moved briefly to the empty chair beside Emilio. The chair that would have been Luca's had Emilio not specifically told his son to stay away. "Where is Luca?" "We expected him." "Luca has other responsibilities." Emilio answered. "Yes." Marco's mouth curved. "We've heard about his responsibilities. The shelter." A pause waited. "And the woman he's entertaining." The room temperature dropped 2 degrees. Emilio's expression did not change. Not a flicker. This was a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where showing anything was the same as bleeding. "I'll consider your proposal and give you my answer in 2 weeks." Marco studied him. Then he sat back. 2 weeks, he agreed. After that, Emilio, the terms change. After they left, Emilio sat alone at the long table. He thought about Grace Holloway. Ginger-haired, blue-eyed, crouched in a diner booth at 9 years old with a red crayon and a piece of notebook paper, with no idea what she was doing. He thought about the note on his study wall. He thought about what the Ferrano family was capable of when people they considered leverage stopped being cooperative. He picked up his phone and called his most trusted man. I need you to find out everything the Ferranos know about the girl, he said quietly, and how long they've known it. He ended the call. And for the first time in 15 years, Emilio Caruso felt the particular cold that came with knowing something good was standing directly in the path of something he could not fully control. He thought of calling Luca and picked up his phone, then put it down. He would tell him. Just not tonight. Tonight he would let his son have whatever small warm moment was happening in that shelter office, because if Emilio's instincts were right, and they were always right, the warmth was about to become very difficult to protect. Outside the estate, the city moved on indifferent, and in a shelter across town, a woman with ginger hair folded a child's crayon drawing carefully into her bag and told herself she had made the right choice. She had no way of knowing that across a table in a room she'd never been in, a man named Marco Ferrano had already said her name, and smiled slowly.
If this story has its hooks in you, good. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Hit like if you're enjoying the story, and subscribe if you haven't already, because you do not want to miss what comes next.
The call came on a Sunday. Grace was in her flat, cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by her mother's things. Miriam had been gone 3 months. The apartment still smelled faintly of her, a perfume, something French and dark, that Grace had never been able to name but would have recognized anywhere. The locked jewelry box had been at the back of the wardrobe, behind 2 winter coats. Small, dark lacquered wood, tarnished at the hinges. The key was where Miriam hid things that mattered. Sewn into the lining of her favorite coat, the gray cashmere she wore until it went thin at the elbows and wore it anyway. Grace found the key. She stared at the box. Grace, open this when I am gone. Not before. She opened it. The photograph was on top. Miriam at perhaps 22, laughing at something off camera in a dress that cost more than a month's rent. Beside her stood a man Grace had never seen. Dark-suited, handsome, one hand at Miriam's waist in the way of someone who considers the person beside them already theirs. On the back, in Miriam's handwriting, Milano. Before I knew better. Then she found the letter. Her name on the front. Sealed. She tore it open with hands that were steady right up until they weren't. She read it once quickly, the way you read something when you know it's going to hurt, and you want to get through the worst of it fast. Then she read it again. I was born into a family in Lyon that dealt in things I will not romanticize for you. I believed in it once, the way young people believe in beautiful, dangerous things. I loved a man in that world. Completely. Foolishly. I watched that world take him. Then my brother. Then my cousin. It did not take them violently. It hollowed them out. It made them capable of things I could not recognize anymore. I ran. I changed my name. I built a small, quiet life, and I filled it with you. I know you, my love. I know your warmth and your stubbornness, and that you find beauty in broken things and try to heal them. I did too once. Please be smarter than I was. Some worlds do not want to be healed. They only want to consume the people who try. Grace sat on the floor with the letter in both hands for a long time. Her mother. The smartest person she had ever known. A laugh that changed rooms. The woman who had looked at a dangerous stranger in a diner and said, "Let's remind him." With such ease, such instinct, that Grace had spent 15 years believing it was simply who her mother was. Now she knew it was also who her mother had been trained to be. And she had still run from it. Grace folded the letter. She looked at the photograph one more time. Her mother young and laughing, standing beside a man with a possessive hand and a beautiful face. She put it back in the box. She did not call Luca that night either. She went to work on Monday the way a person walks into a room where they've left something important, but haven't decided whether to pick it up. Felix brought her a second drawing. 3 figures this time, a small addition beside the dark-haired and orange-haired ones. A brown blob with 4 legs that she stared at until she realized it was a dog. They didn't have a dog. "Are you asking for a dog?" Grace asked. Felix looked at her with the patience of a child who had decided what he wanted and was waiting for the adults to catch up. She was going to have to talk to Sandra. At half, for she knocked on Luca's door. "Come in." She sat down across from his desk, not hovering near the exit. Actually sat. "My mother left me a letter," she said. He set down his pen to listen, and she told him everything. Not reading it out, she had memorized it the way you memorize things that land hard. The family in Lyon. The man Miriam had loved. The hollowing. The running. Luca listened without interrupting. No filling silences. No reassurances before they were earned. Just stillness, and in doing so, space for everything she needed to say. My mother ran, Grace said finally, from a world exactly like yours. I know. He said it carefully. How do you know? She asked, surprised. My father told me. 3 weeks after you started here. The air changed. He knew who I was. Yes. Before I did. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. Why? Because I wanted you to know me before you knew what I came from. If you found out who my father was first, I would just be a name to you. He held her gaze. I didn't want to be a name to you. Grace looked at her hands. Something in her wanted to be angrier than she was. It wasn't the right size for what had actually happened. She wasn't sure what that meant. My mother wrote that I find beauty in broken things, she said, and that it'll get me consumed. She wasn't wrong, he said quietly. No. She looked up. She wasn't. So what happens now? She asked. That's entirely up to you, Lucas said. She didn't decide that night either. She went home, made dinner she barely tasted, and stood at her kitchen window. The letter on her table. The photograph beside it, face down. She thought about her mother, lower, slower voice when something mattered. Some worlds do not want to be healed. She thought about Felix's drawing. The dog. The absolute faith of a child who assumed the future contained things that hadn't arrived yet. She thought about Luca crouching to Felix's level without thinking. The coffee left beside her without a word. The crack in the controlled surface when the boy said her name, and what was underneath it. She picked up the photograph and stared at it. I ran, Miriam had written, and I built a small, quiet life. Small, quiet lives. She had been building one, steadily, with intent. A job that mattered. A flat with one window. Tea in the mornings. She had told herself it was enough, and some days it was. But her mother had also written, I filled it with you. Meaning, Miriam had not filled it with the man in the photograph. She had poured herself entirely into her daughter instead, and Grace had been the fortunate recipient of a love that size. She also knew that her mother had loved the man in the Milano photograph. The letter didn't say it plainly. It didn't need to. It was in every line that tried not to say it. Miriam had run from the right thing and left something unfinished in herself that never healed clean. Grace put the photograph down and picked up her phone. He answered on the second ring. Come to the shelter, she said. She had visited Emilio's study 2 weeks before, arranged it herself, showing up until Luca called ahead to let her through. She had walked into the private study and seen it on the wall immediately. The small framed piece of paper. Faded crayon on a diner napkin. Someone sees you. Eat. She had stood in front of it, unable to move for a full minute. Emilio came to stand beside her without speaking. Then he told her everything, the night, the decision, the way a child's kindness had dismantled something in him that nothing else had ever touched. The day his security team flagged Grace Holloway's employment application, and he had gone very still at his desk. That was 2 weeks ago. Tonight Lucas stood in the shelter doorway, and she had something to say. I read my mother's letter, she said. I know. She ran because she was smart. Grace held his gaze. And I spent the last 2 weeks asking myself if I'm smart enough to do the same. His jaw tightened. Just barely. And, he said. She held out the photograph. He looked at it. He recognized Miriam immediately. Her face for a moment with something that could have been sorrow or respect or both. Then the man beside her. His brow furrowed. I had it looked into, Grace said. The man in that photo is Eduardo Marini. He died in Lyon in 1998. His family was dismantled 2 years before that from the inside by a rival organization. She paused. My mother watched every single person she loved in that world disappear. And then she ran. Luca said nothing. My mother was the smartest person I have ever known, Grace said. And she still couldn't protect herself from loving someone like him. She looked at Luca directly. If she couldn't, then you shouldn't try, he said quietly. That's the conclusion. That was the conclusion, Grace said. For about 12 days. He was very still. Then I kept thinking about what she actually built after she ran, Grace said. A small, quiet life. And she wasn't wrong. It was small and it was quiet and it was. She stopped. Sad, in a way I didn't have words for until I read that letter. Because she never went back and she never forgot, and she spent 30 years being safe and never being whole. The garden was quiet. The city hummed beyond the walls. I'm not saying your world isn't dangerous, Grace said. I'm not saying the name doesn't scare me. I'm saying, she took a breath. I see you, and I'm not running. He crossed the garden in 4 steps. His hands found her face, thumbs at her jaw the way they'd been the first time, and he kissed her with the kind of certainty that had nothing rehearsed in it and everything true. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "Don't tell me to run again," she said. "I won't." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "But I need you to understand something." "Tell me." "The Ferrano family." His voice dropped. "They know about you. My father told me this morning. They brought your name up in a meeting 2 weeks ago." The cold arrived without warning, low in her stomach. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means you are no longer just a woman I care about." His eyes were steady, the gold in them clear in the low light. "It means you're something they think they can use. And from this moment, things change." "Change how?" "You'll have protection. Discreet, you won't notice it. But it'll be there." He searched her face. "And you need to know that agreeing to this, agreeing to us, means agreeing to a life with real risk in it. I can minimize it, but I cannot eliminate it." Grace looked at him. "Luca," she said. "Yes. I grew up with a woman who spent 30 years avoiding risk." She held his gaze. "Look where that left her." He nodded once, and pulled her back in. 3 days later, Grace was at Emilio's estate when it happened. She had come for coffee, something that had quietly become ordinary, the two of them in his study while afternoon light moved across the bookshelves. She had just picked up her cup when the door opened. Luca walked in still in his coat, which meant he had come directly, which meant something was wrong. He looked at his father first. Ferrano made his move. Emilio set down his cup. The ease left his body entirely, replaced by something Grace had not seen in him before, the 40-year version, the one the city feared. "Where?" Emilio said. "Casa Luz." Luca's eyes moved to Grace. "An hour ago. 2 of Ferrano's men. They told Sandra to pass a message." He paused. "The message was for you." Grace's cup was still in her hand. She set it down carefully. "What message?" she said. Luca looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent his whole life managing the distance between the world he came from and the people he wanted to protect, and had just watched that distance collapse. "They said, tell the social worker that her mother made the smart choice." He paused. "And that her daughter won't get the same option twice." The room went very quiet. Grace looked at the framed note on the wall across from her. Small and faded, crayon on a napkin, the first thing she had ever made that mattered without knowing it. "Someone sees you. Eat." She had been 9 years old. She had not known the man at the far end of the diner. She had not known what world she was reaching into when she passed him that note. She had only known he looked sad, and that sadness was a problem she could do something about. 15 years later, standing in the consequence of that kindness, the fear moved through her cleanly, arriving, registering, and then settling into something harder underneath. She looked up at Luca. "Okay," she said. He frowned. "What do you mean by okay?" "They want me scared." She held his gaze. "But I'm not running." Something moved in his face. He crossed the room, crouched beside her chair to her eye level, the same way he did with Felix, and she understood now that it was not a gesture he had learned. It was just him. "This is going to get harder before it gets easier," he said quietly. "I know. The Ferranos don't threaten and then wait." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, Emilio had already picked up his phone, speaking in rapid Italian to someone who answered immediately. "Then we do this together," Luca said. "Yes," she said simply. He stood, and for the first time since she had walked into the office and shaken his hand and told herself the feeling in her chest was only nerves, for the first time, he looked like a man who had stopped bracing for something to be taken from him. Sadly, it lasted only 4 seconds. Because that was when Emilio lowered his phone and looked at them both with the expression Grace had learned to read. The one that meant the information was new and the news was not good. "That wasn't Ferrano's men at the shelter," he said. Luca went very still. "What?" "The 2 men who delivered the message. They work for us. They were ours." He paused. Someone inside turned them. The silence that followed was the kind Grace recognized from the worst moments of her professional life. The silence after the sentence that rearranges everything, when everyone in the room is absorbing the new shape of what they're dealing with. Luca's jaw was set in stone. "Who?" he said. "I don't know yet," Emilio said. Luca turned to Grace. Whatever he was about to say, she stopped him. "Don't," she said. "Grace, don't tell me to go somewhere safe." She held his gaze. "You told me this was going to get harder." "I said I knew." She stood up from her chair. So tell me what we do next. Don't manage me. He looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then he looked at his father. Lock down the estate, he said. Nobody in or out without my clearance. Get me a list of every person who knew about the Ferrano meeting. His eyes came back to Grace. All of them. Emilio was already moving. Luca looked at Grace one last time. Those green eyes with the gold in them, doing what they always did. Registering everything, deciding something. Stay close, he said to her. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere, she said. Outside the estate walls, the city moved the way cities always do. Indifferent, unhurried, entirely unaware that inside a study with a faded crayon note on the wall, something had begun that was not going to end quietly. A little girl had bought food for a lonely stranger. She had not known what world she was reaching into, but she knew now, and she had made the conscious decision to stay anyway. Meanwhile,
If you made it this far, you already know this isn't over. Who turned Emilio's men? How deep does the betrayal go? And what exactly did Grace's mother choose and give up 15 years ago? Sadly, we're not answering those questions today. But don't you worry. If you are not subscribed yet, fix that immediately, because part 2 is coming, and it picks up exactly where this left off. The Richies aren't done, and neither are we.